Sunday's service. Am I on? The Sunday service is the result of an article that appeared in our denomination's national magazine. Though intended to be affirmative and supportive of transgender persons, it had the opposite effect. Rather than choose to center my own cisgender voice, the voices of 3 transgender and non-binary persons in our congregation will be centered this morning. But what I'm about to share is directed toward those of us who are cisgendered and may have wondered, why is this article such a big deal? Why did it become such a lightning rod? And so the following words are selected from the Transforming Hearts Collective, which is the collective of 4 trans and queer faith leaders that support congregations in becoming radically welcoming spiritual homes for queer and trans people of all races, classes, abilities, sexualities, and ages. And I've been in touch with one of those folks, and they've agreed to come out sometime this fall to do a workshop for us and to preach on Sunday morning. Number 1, something I've been trying to say forever: intent does not equal impact. The author of the article had good intentions, yet the impact was that trans persons in our movement have been harmed. And it's that impact, not the intention, that needs to be the focus. Number 2, the article contained false and harmful information. So there are a lot of cis people like myself who feel that the article was or is informative. And unfortunately, the author was not knowledgeable about the subject and thus shared information that was misleading, incorrect, or otherwise problematic. And 4, trans people aren't just being harmed in the act of reading the article, they are being harmed by cis people's reactions to that article. In other words, the article's author modeled asking trans folk harmful and intrusive and often violent questions. And because of that article, those of us who are cis now seem to feel emboldened to follow the author's lead to do the same. And we already know that there are trans and queer and non-binary folks in our churches that have been all of a sudden asked all these questions that they weren't being asked before. Trans UUs of all ages everywhere are now the subject of debate, subject to cis people's opinions about the piece, and burdened with the expectation of educating cis people about their very existence. 5, this is not an example of incremental progress. There was no reason to publish an article that got so much wrong and caused so much pain to trans people. A lot of cis people are saying, but you know what? At least it started a conversation. And it's better than nothing. But in fact, no article at all would have been better than such a harmful article. 6, the article centered a cisgender perspective. If you're having trouble with these terms, you should have been handed at least 4-page or 3-page glossary. If you don't have one, Robin, if they don't have one, you'll get them one. He can't hear me. There he is. Okay, if you need one, put your hand up. Robin will get you one. So I really want to focus on this business of centering because we've heard it used when we're referring to white and black and white supremacy. Centering is a concept that speaks to those whose worldview is most affirmed and whose voices are the loudest, whose perspective is treated as normal and therefore is at the center. Any other worldview or perspective is treated as different and then marginalized. 7, I only have 2 more after this. The article's publication was based on the assumption that cis people's perspectives on trans people are more valuable than trans people's perspectives on ourselves. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of trans UU leaders, writers, poets, and prophets who could have written an incredible feature article about trans lives, spiritualities, struggles within UUism, and more. 8, the author and the editor are neither evil, nor are they being expected to be perfect. The author and editor of the UU World are not bad people, yet they did not heed the counsel and expertise of trans UU leaders when considering the article. They were told that the way the article was being shaped would harm trans persons. Yet even so, they went ahead with the article. And 9, this article isn't an isolated incident. This is our faith's national publication. There have been and continue to be many articles written about those who are marginalized from the perspective of those who are not. The voices that need to be lifted up are not those that have always been heard, but those that have not. Let trans persons, disabled persons, and other marginalized identities speak for themselves in their own words. And so this morning I am grateful that Jean Marie, Frankie, and Jones are speaking for themselves.
Is my throat mic? Oh, I can hear it. Yes, it's on. Well, that's the test.
Now can you hear me? Yes? Excellent. I'm glad. Good morning. So we are actually going to speak. The title is a little bit of a misnomer because we're here to amplify the voices of the many, many trans people who in the last week or so have been responding to this article. And these are going to be quotations from these folks and from articles which I have printed out that are on the greeting card table over there because she and I sit at the greeting card table. So if you want to read the context of these quotes, you can. When we were invited to participate in this service, we felt that just our own voices and thoughts would fail to convey the extent of the hurt experienced by transgender and non-binary clergy and congregation members of many UU churches and fellowships throughout the country, especially at a time when our national government was revealed last week as being opposed to LGBT, and revealed again and again. And we need all the support we can get, and feel we should receive it from our own UU churches and leadership first and foremost. So what we're presenting here are some urgent and cogent points selected from the dozens of statements that transgender UUs have posted to public forums nationwide since the last issue of UU World came out. The spring 2019 UU World article is not the best of Unitarian Universalism. We do not expect perfection. We expect a place at the table and a voice. And that's from Trust, the Transgender Religious Professional UUs Together organization.
Nothing demonstrates unexamined privilege like a cis white feminist who uses a national platform to frame her curiosity about a minor's genitals as a search for truth and understanding, by Imani McFadden.
We are living in a time when trans identity is at the forefront of world politics. Those of us in the United States are living in a country where the audacity of our very trans existence is attacked daily in attempts to erase us and silence our voices. We are living in a UU faith community full of people with whom we have covenanted to live into our best selves, our authentic selves, in a multitude of expressions and complex realities, but who continue to deny us a place at the table even as they examine their internal systems of oppression on other matters. That's also from Trust.
The report of the 2018 survey of trans UU clergy and congregation states that 72% of trans UUs do not feel as though their congregation is completely inclusive of them as trans people. But the highest levels of lack of full inclusion are experienced by trans people of color, trans young adults, and non-binary people.
I've been out as genderqueer for 21 years. After a few years of wrestling with my gender, I put on some metaphorical armor to protect my heart. When I listen to stories from trans youth about how their congregations are refusing to learn their pronouns or constantly misgendering them, I realize how much I've simply accepted these injuries and used my armor to try to brush them away. That's from Reverend Evan Carville Zemer.
Suggesting that the UUA will do everything to return to right relationship and rebuild trust with trans UUs presumes that the UUA was ever in right relationship with trans and non-binary people and that there was ever trust to begin with. The UUA hasn't been, and there hasn't been, over far too many years to count up until right now. I would take way more seriously a statement that tells the truth about how many trans religious professionals of every age and stage have been chewed up and spit out by the Ministerial Fellowship Committee and the UUA National Office, not to mention individual congregations, regions, chapters, and other UU groups, and who don't have sustainable incomes or households because of it. Reverend Michael Stack with Black Lives UU.
Despite trans UUs attending seminaries and being fellowshipped and ordained throughout the 1980s and 90s, no openly trans minister was called by a UU congregation until 2002. It wasn't until 2017 that any openly trans UU ministers of color received final fellowship. To Trust's knowledge, no openly trans woman has ever been called to a settled ministry position by a UU congregation. The majority of trans UUs who have served UU congregations as ordained parish ministers have experienced being pushed out of employment. And that's all from the report on the 2018 survey of trans UUs as relayed by Trust.
During my 20 years as a religious educator with UU congregations, as part of a preparation for a conversation about hire, I was told, don't be too butch. The thinking went like this: if I was going to be a lesbian queer person working with children in a Sunday school, I should downplay my masculinity. I didn't have to put on a dress they promised, but really, the button-up shirts and bolo ties should probably go. It was also recommended that I use the name Cindy and avoid my preferred nickname CB because Cindy was more professional. Expecting some people to modify themselves for others' comfort is a poor starting point for engagement with a faith tradition, CB Beale. But I would like to say that CB, as Cindy, was the director of the religious education for the very first UU church we were ever in Northampton, Mass. And not until I read this did I suspect for 1 minute that Cindy was trans. She did such a good job of performing her role as someone she really wasn't.
The Trainers from Beyond Categorical Thinking, a program that helps congregations explore their unidentified biases in the search for a settled minister, consistently today hear from ministers of congregations in a search process that they wouldn't feel, from members of congregations in a search process, that they wouldn't feel comfortable calling a trans minister today. That's also from CB Beale.
The good news is this: if Unitarian Universalists can get honest about the harm to trans UUs, we can do something about it. I hope that you, if you are a cisgender person, will allow that truth to awaken your own empathy for the fact that being excluded is so much more hurtful than being responsible for exclusion. Reverend Teresa I. Soto.
I would like this church to become a sanctuary. I want Unitarian Universalism to be a sanctuary in deed as much as in word. I want Unitarian Universalism to take on the risk of helping society's most vulnerable. I want Unitarian Universalism to lead instead of reconcile. I want Unitarian Universalism to need no argument to claim that we value the inherent worth and dignity of each human. I want it to be plainly obvious from our behavior. And that's from Imani McFadden. All right.
I love this church, this congregation, this community. I appreciate you, and I feel both loved and challenged to be a better person when I am in this space. But I need to be honest today. Every time I get ready to walk through the doors into this church, I put up some armor because I don't feel totally safe here. I know that every Sunday I will be misgendered despite having pronouns on my name tag. I know that every Sunday I will likely encounter someone who reacts uncomfortably or defensively when I correct their pronoun errors. I know that every Sunday I'll hear a hymn or a reading or a story or a part of the sermon or greeting that assumes that there are only two genders present and that we all have been identified as being the gender that we truly are. I am a non-binary trans man, so I get questions about why I have two pronouns, why I'm he or they, not just he or just they, why I'm non-binary instead of being a man or a woman. When I'm having surgery, whether I take hormones, I am asked a lot of very personal and othering questions. Quite honestly, it is exhausting. And given that I have chronic pain, and given that I also experience microaggressions about my being disabled, some days I just don't have enough energy to come here. I don't have the energy to put up those shields that I need, because each time someone denies my gender identity, I know I will feel disconnected from our congregation. From you, I will feel more like I'm seen as the other. So many of you talk about this church as a place where we accept all people, where all are safe and loved. I feel loved, truly I do, but I don't always feel safe. This isn't a safe and accepting place for me, and it should be. It can be. And to make it so, you've got to change some things. We've got to change some things. The assumptions that people make about who I am and what pronouns are mine are rooted in an old idea of gender. I think it's time we tossed that old idea out. And honestly, our old ideas about disability and class and a whole lot of other things should go as well. By doing so, we make room for people who aren't always here. Change is inevitable. I'm asking that you remember that we includes me. It includes all of us. By listening to each other, by letting people tell their own stories, by apologizing when we make mistakes, and by working hard to do better, we can make this church into the place we want it to be. We can make it a place where I can be myself and be accepted as such without question, without doubts, without excuses. I want to be very clear. I am not asking that you be perfect. I am certainly not perfect. I make mistakes all the time. I even misgender myself. What I am asking, however, is that you shift your mindset. Instead of telling me that all this new gender stuff is confusing and you just can't figure it out, think about how that would sound if I said it about you. And remind yourself that you can learn. You can. And when it starts with reminding yourself that you hurt people when you get it wrong. That's a pretty good motivator, right? And most of all, I ask that you give yourself a break, but not an excuse. We are all growing and learning. It's okay to get it wrong sometimes. Just correct yourself and move on, remembering to do better next time. This is my religious home. I love you all. And I want to walk into this building knowing that you see me as who I am. Jones David Hollister, disabled, non-binary trans man, teacher, goofball, and Unitarian Universalist.
There are many ways that this morning's sermon time could have been approached. Most of the ways, though, would have perpetuated harm to those who are transgender, queer, or non-binary. How? Well, I could have talked about all the ways that I've acted that were oppressive to trans folks, which would really have been doing two things at the same time: exposing them to more stories of being treated as other, and indirectly asking for forgiveness. I could have talked about comments or actions others have expressed that were harmful or othering to trans folks, which would have been to pass that harm along to them yet again. I could have talked about my own journey in the alphabet soup of terms and definitions, but that would have decentered the voices of transgender, queer, and non-binary persons. And I would have done all of that in the name of trying to raise awareness, to educate, and take on oppression. Again, I say to you, intention does not equal impact. As Jones said in their video, we will make mistakes, and we will get it wrong in this journey toward co-conspiratorship and justice making. Again, this does not excuse us from doing the work, or of apologizing, of learning from our mistakes, or of beginning again. We are a covenantal faith tradition, which means that when we cause harm, unintentionally or otherwise, we are bound to restoration and renewal of right relationship. My gratitude to both cisgender and transgender persons in this congregation that have not so much called me out, but have called me in and back to relationship when I get it wrong. And may that be a model for us all. May it be so.